The security doors locked with a hollow metallic thud, just as the receptionist said, "I'm sorry, ma'am, you'll have to wait outside." The sentence landed harder than a slap. Margaret Lewis stood still in the narrow corridor, her coat still on, her leather briefcase resting against her leg, the low hum of the executive floor vibrating under her feet. Through the frosted glass wall to her left, she could see shadows moving inside the boardroom. Laughter, chairs scraping, someone clinking a coffee mug against the table like punctuation. She had not been late. She had not been early. She had arrived exactly on time. The young receptionist avoided her eyes, fingers hovering over the keyboard as if typing could erase what she had just said. Her voice had been polite. Too polite. The kind of politeness that came from training, not respect. "The executive session is already in progress. They ask that no one interrupt." No one. Margaret felt the words settle in her chest, slow and cold. She did not argue. She did not raise her voice. She simply nodded once and stepped aside, positioning herself against the wall beneath a framed photograph of the company's first factory. Black and white, smokestacks, men in work boots, a woman in the center, younger, sharper, standing with her hands folded and her chin lifted. Herself, 40 years ago. The corridor smelled faintly of disinfectant and burnt coffee. The air conditioning clicked on, too cold, too loud. Margaret could hear her own breathing now. Controlled, even. Years of discipline kept it that way. Inside the boardroom, Richard Coleman's voice rose above the others. Confident, warm, the practiced sound of a man who believed he owned the room. "If we push this through before the next earnings call, the board won't have time to second-guess it." A chuckle followed. Someone else laughed. Margaret closed her eyes for a brief second, not in anger but in recognition. She had heard that tone before, decades ago. It always came before something broke. A man brushed past her in the hallway, mid-level executive by the look of him, late 40s, gray at the temples. He glanced at her, then looked away, already reaching for his phone. "They're still going," he muttered, not to her, but into the air. "This meeting's a bloodbath." He did not slow, did not ask who she was, did not notice the photograph behind her. Margaret opened her eyes. The glass wall reflected her face faintly. Calm, composed. A 63-year-old black woman in a tailored coat that had seen better days, standing alone outside her own office. Anyone watching would have assumed she was a consultant, or a retired board member clinging to relevance, or worse, someone's assistant waiting for permission. Inside the room, Thomas Wright spoke next. His voice was sharper, thinner. "Legal will clean it up. They always do." Papers shuffled. A pen tapped twice. "We just need alignment. Once it's done, it's done." Alignment. Margaret felt something tighten low in her stomach. Not rage, not yet. Something older. Disappointment sharpened into resolve. She shifted her weight slightly, the briefcase creaking as the leather flexed. Inside it were documents she had read late into the night, under a single lamp, while the rest of the house slept. Audit summaries, email threads, draft proposals that never reached the board, numbers that did not add up until they did. This was not a surprise visit. This was confirmation. The receptionist cleared her throat. "Would you like some water while you wait?" Margaret turned her head slowly. The young woman looked nervous now, sensing something she could not name. Margaret studied her face. Early 20s, careful makeup, eyes trained to follow rules, not question them. "No," Margaret said softly. "I'm fine." The door to the boardroom opened suddenly. A man stepped out, jacket off, tie loosened. Paul Henderson, Senior Operations. He stopped short when he saw her. His brows pulled together, confusion flickering across his face. "Can I help you?" he asked, not unkindly, but distracted. Margaret met his gaze, held it, said nothing. Paul shifted, cleared his throat. "We're in the middle of something sensitive." He gestured vaguely toward the door. "You might want to check back later." Behind him, through the open door, Margaret saw the long table, the polished surface, the chairs she had chosen herself years ago for comfort during long decisions. She saw Richard at the head, leaning back, one ankle resting on his knee, hands spread like a man explaining the weather. She saw Thomas beside him, eyes sharp, jaw tight. She saw faces she recognized and faces she did not. None of them were looking at her. Paul followed her gaze, then stepped aside, instinctively closing the door between them. The click was soft, final. "Sorry about that," he said, already turning away. Margaret did not move. Time stretched. The clock at the end of the hall ticked once, twice. The sound echoed louder than it should have. Margaret counted her breaths. She thought of Cleveland winters, of the first factory floor she had walked at dawn, steel-toed boots crunching on frozen gravel. Of the loan officer who had laughed when she asked for capital. Of the workers who had trusted her with their lives, their mortgages, their children's futures. Inside the boardroom, applause broke out. Brief, self-satisfied. Someone said, "To new horizons." Margaret's jaw tightened. A vibration buzzed against her palm. Her phone still in her coat pocket. A message preview lit the screen faintly. Daniel Harris. One line. "They're voting without the board." She slipped the phone back without replying. Her pulse remained steady. If anything, the clarity sharpened. From the inside, the room sounded sealed, protected. From the outside, it looked fragile. A glass wall, a locked door, a belief that power only flowed one way. Margaret straightened, rolling her shoulders back. The corridor seemed narrower now, the air heavier. The receptionist watched her from the corner of her eye, sensing movement, tension, something about to shift. Margaret stepped forward, not toward the door yet, toward the photograph on the wall. She lifted it gently, tilting it so the overhead light caught the faces inside. Her younger self stared back, unblinking. "They forgot," Margaret murmured, barely louder than breath. Behind the glass, Richard's laughter rose again, sharp and careless. Margaret turned. Her hand tightened around the handle of her briefcase. The leather was warm now, familiar, grounding. She took one measured step toward the boardroom door, then another. The lock remained engaged, for now. The boardroom lights dimmed automatically as the presentation shifted to a new slide. Inside, the air had grown warmer, heavier, carrying the faint smell of coffee gone stale and polished wood absorbing years of confident decisions. Richard Coleman leaned forward now, elbows on the table, fingers steepled. The screen behind him glowed with charts and arrows, all pointing forward, all insisting on inevitability. "This is the moment," he said. "We either move or we let the market eat us alive." Several heads nodded. A few did not. Those faces stayed still, careful. No one wanted to be the first to hesitate. At the far end of the table, Ellen Porter adjusted her glasses. 61 years old, former manufacturing counsel, brought onto the board back when the company still smelled like oil and steel instead of glass and cologne. Her lips pressed into a thin line. "This assumes consent we don't have," she said quietly. Richard smiled without warmth. "We have enough." "Enough silence," Ellen replied. A beat passed. Then Thomas Wright cleared his throat, sharp and deliberate. "Margaret Lewis has not attended an executive session in over 3 years," he said. "She delegated authority. We are operating within that framework." Outside in the corridor, Margaret paused mid-step. Delegated authority. The phrase echoed with a strange hollowness. She had chosen those words herself once, spoken into a microphone in this very building, her voice steady, her hands trembling just enough to remind her that trust was always a risk. She had believed in succession, believed in continuity, believed that stepping back did not mean surrendering the soul of what she built. Inside the boardroom, Ellen's voice hardened. "Delegation is not abdication." Richard turned toward her, tone softening, almost paternal. "With respect, Ellen, the company cannot remain frozen by nostalgia." Nostalgia. Margaret felt a slow heat rise behind her eyes. Not tears, not yet, but memory. The first winter layoffs she had avoided by mortgaging her own house. The nights spent rewriting supplier contracts to save a single production line. Nostalgia had never kept anyone employed. Responsibility had. The receptionist shifted in her chair. She glanced at the corridor clock, then at Margaret's back. 5 minutes had passed, maybe 6. Time behaved differently in moments like this, stretching and compressing without permission. The elevator at the end of the hall chimed softly. A man stepped out. Daniel Harris, 47, tall, lean. His jacket hung open, tie loosened. He stopped short when he saw Margaret. For a fraction of a second, his composure slipped. Then he recovered. Too quickly. "Ms. Lewis," he said, keeping his voice low. He did not smile. He did not look surprised. He looked relieved. Margaret turned to face him fully now. Their eyes met. Daniel's carried something raw beneath the professionalism. Fear, maybe, or urgency sharpened by long restraint. "They're moving fast," he said. "Faster than planned." Margaret nodded once. "I know." He hesitated. His gaze flicked to the frosted glass, then back to her. "They're about to formalize it. A vote by show of hands. No recorded minutes." Margaret studied his face, the tension in his jaw, the way his fingers flexed at his side as if resisting the urge to act. "Why tell me now?" she asked. Daniel swallowed. "Because once they do it, they'll claim momentum. And because—" He stopped himself, then continued. "Because this company is not a balance sheet to me. My father worked the night shift at the old plant. He lost 2 fingers to a press that should have been replaced years earlier. Margaret Lewis signed the order that shut that line down, saved 3 lives after him." Margaret felt something in her chest give. Not soften, steady. Inside the boardroom, Richard raised his hand. "All in favor?" Chairs creaked, hands lifted. Not all, but enough. Margaret inhaled slowly. Daniel stepped aside, giving her a clear path to the door. "They locked it," he said. "Security override only." Margaret glanced at the keypad beside the door. Black, polished, new, installed after her last visit. She reached into her coat and withdrew a slim card, edges worn smooth with time. Daniel's eyes widened. "That still works?" "It was never deactivated," Margaret said. "Some things were built to last." She slid the card into the slot. The lock disengaged with a clean mechanical click. Inside, applause rose again, louder this time, cutting itself short as the door opened. Every head turned. The room froze. Margaret stepped inside. The temperature shifted. Conversations died mid-breath. Richard's smile faltered just slightly before snapping back into place. "Margaret," he said, standing, "this is unexpected." She did not answer immediately. She took in the room instead, the faces, the posture, the way some avoided her eyes while others stared too long, trying to place her. She walked to the end of the table without haste, each step measured, deliberate. "Unexpected," she repeated softly. Thomas Wright rose halfway from his chair, then stopped, uncertain. "We were under the impression you weren't attending today." Margaret placed her briefcase on the table. The sound was firm, final. "You were under many impressions," she said, "most of them incorrect." Silence stretched, taut as wire. Richard gestured toward a chair. "Please, sit. We can brief you." Margaret did not sit. "I was asked to wait in the hallway," she said. Her voice was calm, but it carried. "While decisions were made about the future of a company I founded, a company whose controlling shares remain mine." A murmur rippled around the table. Ellen Porter's breath caught audibly. Richard's face tightened. "This is about efficiency," he said, "about survival." Margaret turned to him fully now. Her gaze was steady, unblinking. "Survival without memory is not survival," she said. "It is erosion." She reached into her briefcase. Paper slid against leather. A folder emerged, thick, labeled, precise. Across the room, someone shifted in their seat. Another glanced toward the door. Margulies placed the folder on the table, fingers resting on it for a moment longer than necessary. "Before we proceed," she said, "there are matters of governance, disclosure, and duty that must be addressed." Richard opened his mouth. She raised a hand. Not high, not dramatic, just enough. He stopped. Outside, the corridor clock ticked again. Inside the boardroom, something ancient and unavoidable began to surface. The realization that the woman they had underestimated had not come to observe. She had come to decide. The folder stayed closed. That was what unsettled them first. Margaret Lewis did not rush. She did not scatter pages or read aloud like a prosecutor hungry for reaction. She simply stood there, one hand resting on the leather edge, eyes moving slowly from face to face. Each pause felt intentional, measured, like a surgeon counting breaths before the incision. Richard broke first. "If this is about procedure," he said, forcing a lightness into his tone, "we can schedule a follow-up with counsel present." Counsel. Margaret turned her head slightly, just enough to acknowledge the word. "Your counsel," she said, "or the company's." The room shifted. Someone exhaled sharply. A chair leg scraped the floor as Thomas Wright adjusted his stance, fingers tightening around the back of his seat. "This isn't a courtroom," Thomas said. "We're discussing strategy." Margaret nodded once. "Then you should be relieved," she replied, "because what's in this folder is not argument. It's record." She opened it. The sound was quiet, paper sliding free, but in the stillness of the room, it landed with weight. She did not hand anything around yet. She read nothing aloud. Instead, she spoke. "3 quarters ago," she said, "operating capital from the Cleveland Plant Modernization Fund was reclassified as discretionary travel and external consulting." Thomas stiffened. "That was approved internally." "Internally?" Margaret repeated. "Not by the board, not by me." Richard leaned back, arms crossing. "We had authority." "You had access," Margaret said. "There's a difference." Daniel Harris remained standing near the door, silent now, watching the exchange with the focus of someone standing on a fault line. He knew the numbers. He had lived inside them for months, watching signals flare and vanish as reports were revised, softened, delayed. Ellen Porter spoke again. Her voice trembled, not with fear, but with restrained anger. "Why wasn't this escalated?" Thomas turned toward her. "Because escalation creates panic." Margaret's gaze snapped to him, sharp, immediate. "No," she said. "Escalation creates accountability. Panic comes from concealment." She slid a single document across the table, not toward Richard, toward Ellen. Ellen picked it up, read the first line. Then the second. Her face changed. The lines around her mouth deepened, eyes narrowing as comprehension replaced disbelief. "This is incomplete," Richard said quickly. "You're seeing fragments without context." Margaret closed the folder again. "Context," she said softly, "is what men use when they want time." The air felt thinner now. Someone near the middle of the table swallowed hard. Another man, younger, recently promoted, avoided looking at the papers altogether, staring instead at the grain of the table as if it might open and swallow him. Margaret turned slightly, addressing the room rather than any one person. "You believed," she said, "that my absence meant distance. That distance meant disinterest, and that disinterest meant permission." Her voice did not rise. It did not need to. "I did not leave this company," she continued. "I stepped back so it could breathe without me, so you could prove what you claimed to be." Richard stood now, palms flat on the table. "This is turning personal," he said. "That's not productive." Margaret tarred his eyes, held them. "Everything about leadership is personal," she said. "You just forgot who it belongs to." A phone vibrated somewhere on the table. No one moved to silence it. Margaret reached back into her briefcase and withdrew another folder, thinner, red tab. She placed it beside the first. "This," she said, "is the succession plan you submitted to the board last winter, the one I was told would remain preliminary." Thomas's face drained of color. Margaret continued, unflinching. "It outlines a divestment timeline for core manufacturing assets. It reallocates intellectual property to a subsidiary structured for acquisition, and it guarantees executive retention packages triggered by strategic exit." Richard laughed once, short, disbelieving. That document never left draft. Daniel spoke then. His voice cut clean through the tension. It left draft, he said, when it was sent to external analysts. Every eye turned to him. Richard stared. You had no authority to. Daniel didn't back down. I had a duty, he said. His hands shook slightly now, but he didn't hide it. To the people who work nights in your plants, to the engineers who still believe this place stands for something. Silence swallowed the room. Margaret looked at Daniel then, not with surprise, with recognition. She turned back to the table. You plan to sell the spine of this company, she said, and call it evolution. You plan to walk away intact while Cleveland carried the hollowed shell. Thomas's voice cracked. That's not fair. Margaret's reply was immediate. Fair is irrelevant, she said. Truth is not. She straightened, drawing herself to full height. The room felt smaller now, as if the walls themselves were listening. Under the company's charter, she said, the controlling shareholder retains emergency authority to suspend executive function in cases of material misrepresentation and breach of fiduciary duty. Richard's jaw clenched. You wouldn't dare do this without a formal vote. Margaret's eyes did not leave him. This is the vote, she said. Ellen pushed her chair back slowly and stood. Her voice, when she spoke, was steady. I second. A murmur surged, then fell away. Margaret exhaled once, not relief, resolve. Effective immediately, she said. Executive authority is suspended pending review. Security will disable access credentials within the hour. Legal counsel will contact each of you individually. Thomas's chair scraped back violently. You can't just erase us. Margaret looked at him, truly looked, for the first time. You erased yourselves, she said. Outside the room, the corridor clock ticked on. Inside, something old and foundational shifted. Not loudly, not theatrically, but permanently. And as Margaret closed her briefcase, the realization settled into the room like a slow, inescapable shadow. This was no longer their company. It never had been. The silence that followed was not empty. It was crowded with thought, calculation, and the quiet terror of men realizing the ground beneath them had shifted while they were too busy admiring the view. Richard Coleman sat back down slowly, as if sudden movement might fracture something already cracked. His confidence did not vanish, it reorganized. This is highly irregular, he said, voice controlled, almost reasonable. You're invoking emergency authority without giving the board time to review the full implications. Margaret watched him the way she once watched a machine under stress, listening for the sound that meant failure was imminent. The full implications, she said, have been unfolding for months. You simply mistook my silence for ignorance. Thomas Wright remained standing, hands braced on the table, knuckles pale. This will rattle the market, he said. People will panic. You'll destabilize the very thing you claim to protect. Margaret tilted her head slightly. Stability built on concealment is already broken, she replied. The question is whether we acknowledge it now or pretend until it collapses on its own. At the far end, a younger executive named Mark Ellison shifted in his chair. He had joined the company barely 2 years earlier, brought in with promises of innovation and speed. His voice was quiet. If this goes public without context, employees will assume the worst. Margaret turned toward him, her expression softening by a fraction. They already do, she said. They feel it in the way projects stall, in the way decisions arrive without explanation. People don't panic when leaders are honest. They panic when leaders disappear. Daniel Harris cleared his throat. Server logs confirm unusual access patterns, he said, choosing his words carefully. External mirrors were created without standard oversight. If left active, they could be exploited. Richard shot him a look. You've gone far beyond your remit. Daniel met his gaze. So did you. That was when the door opened. Not dramatically, not slammed, just opened. Eleanor Brooks stepped inside, her posture composed, a slim tablet tucked under her arm. 60 years old, steel gray hair pulled back neatly. Her eyes moved across the room in a single sweep, taking in the standing men, the scattered documents, Margaret at the center. "I received the call," Eleanor said, "and the preliminary files." Richard straightened. "Eleanor, this is not the time." She didn't look at him. "This is precisely the time," she replied. Margaret nodded once. "Thank you for coming." Eleanor moved to the table and set the tablet down. "For clarity," she said, addressing the room, "I represent Harrison Industrial Systems, not individual officers." Thomas scoffed. "Of course you do." Eleanor finally looked at him. "Which is why you should sit down," she said calmly. He did. She turned to Margaret. "Based on the documentation provided, you are within your rights to enact interim suspension. However, execution matters." Margaret's voice remained even. "Then we will be precise." Eleanor tapped the tablet. "Access credentials will be limited, not terminated, pending formal separation. This protects continuity while preventing interference." Richard exhaled slowly. "You're dismantling leadership in real time." Margaret answered without hesitation. "I am removing obstruction." A low murmur rippled through the room. Fear now mixed with something else. Regret, perhaps, or the dawning realization that power did not argue, it simply arrived. Ellen Porter spoke again, her voice firm. "We need a statement prepared before word spreads." Margaret nodded. "It will not be written by public relations," she said. "It will be written by truth." She turned toward the window, looking out over Cleveland's skyline. The river cut through the city like a scar and a lifeline at once. "This company was not built to be sold in pieces," she said quietly. "It was built to endure." Richard stood abruptly. "You can't expect people to follow you after this," he said, frustration finally breaking through. "You vanished for years." Margaret turned back to him. Her eyes held something deeper now. Not anger, history. "I didn't vanish," she said. "I trusted." The word hung in the air, heavier than any accusation. Daniel shifted closer to the table. "Systems can be locked down within 30 minutes, he said, "if you authorize it." Margaret looked at Eleanor. Eleanor nodded. "Do it," Margaret said. Daniel didn't smile. He simply moved, already pulling out his phone, speaking in low, precise sentences as he stepped toward the door. "Initiate containment. Flag executive-level access first. No alerts." Richard watched him go, disbelief etched across his face. "You're letting a technician decide the fate of this company." Margaret corrected him gently. "I'm letting someone who still remembers what it stands for protect it." The room felt smaller now, not because of walls, but because the future had arrived and there was nowhere left to hide from it. Eleanor began assigning tasks, her voice efficient, unyielding. Phones came out, notes were taken. The machinery of transition began to turn. Margaret remained still, absorbing the moment. She thought of the first time she'd signed payroll checks by hand, of the men who'd looked at her like she was temporary, of the years she spent proving permanence. Richard sank back into his chair, deflated. "What happens to us?" he asked quietly. Margaret met his eyes. "That will depend," she said, "on what else comes to light." The corridor clock chimed softly. Outside the boardroom, employees moved through their day unaware that the center of their working lives had just been rebalanced. Inside, the old order was already receding, replaced by something harder, quieter, and far more dangerous to those who had mistaken control for ownership. Margaret closed her eyes for a brief moment, then opened them again. There was still work to do. The news did not travel through the building like a wave. It moved like a fault line, invisible at first, then suddenly undeniable. Phones buzzed. Slack channels went quiet, then filled with half-sentences and unanswered questions. On the executive floor, doors that were usually open stood closed. On the factory floors below, machines kept running, but conversations grew shorter, more careful. Margaret left the boardroom without ceremony. She did not take the private elevator. She chose the main one, the one employees used, the one that stopped on every floor. Eleanor Brooks walked beside her, tablet tucked under her arm, already fielding calls in a low voice. Margaret said nothing. She watched the numbers above the doors descend, one floor at a time, each ding a reminder of how many lives were tied to what had just happened upstairs. When the doors opened on the engineering level, Daniel Harris was already there, standing near the glass wall of the server room. His jacket was off now, sleeves rolled up. His posture was rigid, focused, like a man bracing for impact. "They're locked out," he said quietly as Margaret approached. "No alerts sent. Access mirrors are frozen. External pathways severed." Margaret nodded. "And the backups?" "Clean," Daniel said. "We isolated anything touched in the last 6 months. Nothing critical moved without leaving a trace." Margaret studied his face. The tension in his shoulders had not eased, but something else had crept in. Relief, maybe, or responsibility settling into place. "You understand what this means for you," she said. Daniel did not look away. "I do. This will make enemies," Margaret continued, "some loud, some patient." He gave a small, humorless smile. They were already there. Eleanor finished her call and turned to them. "Media will have the story within the hour," she said. "Not details, just disruption. We need to speak to the employees before speculation does more damage than truth." Margaret glanced through the glass at the rows of servers, lights blinking steadily, indifferent to human fear. "Then we don't wait," she said. "We speak now." They moved toward the atrium. The space was already filling. People stood in clusters, engineers with arms crossed, plant supervisors with grease still on their hands, office staff holding coffee cups they'd forgotten to drink. Faces turned as Margaret stepped into view. Some recognized her immediately. Others took a second longer, recognition spreading slowly, like dawn. The murmur grew, then quieted. Margaret climbed the short steps to the podium. She did not wait for silence. She stood until it arrived on its own. "I won't insult you by pretending nothing has changed," she began. Her voice carried without strain. Years of factory floors and union halls had taught her how to speak without shouting. "Yes," she continued, "members of the executive leadership team have been removed from their roles effective immediately." A ripple moved through the crowd. Not panic. Surprise, edged with something sharper. Margaret raised a hand, not to stop them, but to steady the moment. "This was not a reaction," she said. "It was a correction." She paused, letting that settle. For months, decisions were made without transparency. Plans were drafted that put short-term gain ahead of long-term stability. That is not who we are. Someone near the front spoke up. A man in his late 50s, plant foreman by the look of him. "Are our jobs safe?" Margaret met his gaze directly. "Yes," she said. "Your jobs are safe." A breath moved through the room, collective, unspoken. "This company exists because of the work done in rooms like this," she continued, "on lines that run overnight, in labs where problems don't care about titles. No one here is disposable." She turned slightly, gesturing toward Daniel, who stood just off to the side. "Daniel Harris will serve as acting chief technology officer," she said, "not because he sought the role, but because he protected this company when it mattered." Eyes shifted. Whispers followed. Daniel stiffened, then straightened, absorbing the weight of it. Margaret's voice softened just enough. "Leadership is not about being the loudest in the room," she said. "It's about being accountable when no one is watching." Silence held. "I will serve as interim chief executive," she added, "for a defined transition period. My task is simple: stabilize operations, restore trust, build a leadership team that understands stewardship is not optional." She stepped back from the podium. For a moment, nothing happened. Then someone clapped. One pair of hands, then another. It did not swell into a roar. It did not need to. It was steady, measured, like a heartbeat finding its rhythm again. Margaret left the atrium the way she had entered, walking, accessible, pausing when people spoke to her, a hand on a shoulder here, a nod there. She listened more than she spoke. By the time she returned to the executive floor, the sun was lowering, casting long bands of gold across the empty boardroom. The chairs sat where they had been left, some pushed back, some crooked. Evidence of urgency without grace. Margaret stood at the head of the table. For the first time since entering the building, she allowed herself to sit. The chair creaked softly under her weight. Familiar. Solid. She placed her hands on the table, palms down, feeling the cool surface beneath her skin. Eleanor entering quietly. "The board will convene tonight," she said. "Remotely. They want answers." "They'll get them," Margaret replied. Eleanor hesitated. "Are you all right?" Margaret considered the question, thought of the men she had trusted, the years she had believed distance could protect integrity, the cost of learning otherwise. "I am," she said finally, "because we caught it in time." Outside the windows, Cleveland settled into evening. Lights flickered on across the city. Factories hummed. Homes filled with dinner and television and ordinary life. Margaret looked out over it all, the weight of responsibility pressing in, not crushing, but firm. She had not come back to reclaim power. She had come back to prevent something from being broken beyond repair. And this time, she was not leaving it unattended again. Night settled over the building in layers. By the time the board convened remotely, the executive floor had gone quiet, the kind of quiet that came not from rest, but from held breath. Screens glowed behind glass walls. The city beyond the windows blinked steadily, unaware that an old center of gravity had shifted inside a single room. Margaret sat at the head of the table, jacket folded neatly beside her, sleeves buttoned down. She had not eaten. She had not noticed. Eleanor Brooks stood to her right, tablet open, posture precise. On the wall-sized screen, faces appeared one by one. Board members dialing in from homes, offices, one from a hospital room with a curtain half drawn behind him. No one spoke at first. Margaret recognized them all. Some had voted with her for decades. Others had joined later, brought in for modernity, for speed. She wondered, not for the first time, how many had suspected something was wrong and chosen comfort over confrontation. "Let's begin," she said. Her voice did not fill the room. It anchored it. Ellen Porter appeared on the screen, glasses perched low on her nose. "We've received preliminary materials," she said. "Not all of us have had time to review." "You've had enough," Margaret replied gently. "This isn't a presentation, it's an accounting." A man named Harold Finch leaned closer to his camera. 72, former logistics executive. "You suspended an entire leadership tier without prior notice," he said. "That's unprecedented." Margaret nodded. So was what they were preparing to do. Another face appeared sharper, younger. Karen Mitchell, private equity background. "There are market implications," she said. "If this isn't handled carefully, the stock—" Margaret raised a hand. The gesture was small, but it stopped her. "I'm aware of the market," Margaret said, "but I will not allow this board to confuse valuation with value." Silence followed, the kind that made people sit straighter. Eleanor stepped forward. "We have verified unauthorized reallocations," she said. "We have evidence of suppressed disclosures. We have draft agreements that materially alter the company's structure without board consent." Harold frowned. "Why weren't we informed earlier?" Margaret answered before Eleanor could. "Because the information you were receiving was curated." Karen bristled. "Are you suggesting manipulation?" "I'm stating it," Margaret said. "There's a difference." A murmur moved through the screen. Someone muted, then unmuted, uncertain. Margaret leaned forward slightly, resting her forearms on the table. "I trusted the people I put in charge," she said. "That trust was misplaced. That is my failure. But allowing it to continue would be yours." The words landed hard, not accusatory, but final. Ellen spoke again. "I support the interim suspension." One by one, others followed. Hesitant at first, then steadier. Harold nodded. Karen looked away, then back. "For the record," she said, "this will require a clear transition plan." "You'll have one," Margaret replied. "And you'll have oversight. Real oversight." The vote concluded without ceremony. When the screens went dark, the room felt larger, empty. Margaret exhaled slowly, feeling the weight shift again, this time settling rather than pressing. Eleanor closed her tablet. "It's done." Margaret nodded. "For now." They stood in silence for a moment. The hum of the building systems filled the space. Margaret felt it in her bones, the way you feel a storm long before rain. Eleanor spoke softly. "You could have delegated this." Margaret's mouth curved slightly. "I did," she said. "Once." Eleanor studied her. "And now?" Margaret turned toward the window. The city lights reflected faintly in the glass, superimposed over her own face. "Now I remember why I never wanted distance in the first place." A knock sounded at the door. Light, respectful. Daniel stepped in. His hair was damp, as if he'd washed his face in a hurry. "We found something," he said. Margaret turned. "What kind of something?" "The kind they didn't think anyone would read," Daniel replied. He held up a drive, small, unassuming. Buried archive, time-stamped before the audit window. Eleanor stiffened. "What's on it?" Daniel hesitated. "Contingency communications, external parties, language about workforce reductions post-divestment." Margaret closed her eyes for a brief second. "How bad?" she asked. Daniel swallowed. "Worse than we thought." Margaret opened her eyes. The softness was gone now, replaced by something colder, more precise. "Get it duplicated," she said. "Secure chain of custody. I want legal review before sunrise." Daniel nodded and turned to go, then stopped. "There's something else." Margaret waited. "They assumed you wouldn't come back," he said. "The language, the tone. They spoke about you like a chapter already closed." Margaret absorbed that, felt the sting, then the clarity. "They mistook age for absence," she said. "It's a common error." Daniel hesitated again. "Some of the staff, they're afraid this will blow back on them." Margaret's gaze softened. "Then tomorrow morning," she said, "we walk the floors again. We answer questions. We don't hide." Daniel nodded. "They'll remember that." When he left, Eleanor watched Margaret carefully. "You're carrying more than you should." Margaret smiled faintly. "I always have." Eleanor hesitated. "What about Richard and Thomas?" Margaret's eyes hardened. "They'll have counsel. They'll have process. And they'll have consequences." The night deepened. Margaret remained in the boardroom long after Eleanor left, reviewing documents alone. Her handwriting filled margins, notes sharp, decisive. Every so often she paused, fingers resting on the page, memories flickering through her mind. Younger versions of the men she had trusted. Laughter at company picnics. Handshakes that had meant something once. She did not indulge the nostalgia. Just before midnight, she stood and turned off the lights herself. The hallway greeted her with stillness. The photograph on the wall caught her eye again. She stopped in front of it, studying her younger face. Fearless, tired, hopeful. "You did your part," she said quietly. The elevator carried her down through darkened floors, past silent desks and sleeping machines. When the doors opened in the lobby, the security guard looked up, startled. "Ma'am," he said quickly, standing. Margaret nodded to him. "Long night." "Yes, ma'am." She stepped outside into the cool Cleveland air. The city smelled like rain and steel and something older, enduring. Margaret paused on the steps, drawing in a breath that filled her lungs and steadied her heart. Tomorrow would be harder. Tomorrow would be louder. But tonight she had done what she came to do. She had stopped the quiet unraveling of something worth saving, and she was not done yet. Morning did not arrive gently. It came with headlines. By the time Margaret stepped back into the building just after 6, the lobby screens were already cycling through news alerts. Words like leadership shakeup, governance crisis, unexpected return crawled along the bottom of polished glass. The security guard straightened when he saw her, eyes wide with something close to awe now, not confusion. "Good morning, Ms. Lewis," he said. Margaret nodded. "Morning." Her phone vibrated before she reached the elevator. A message from Eleanor. Legal requests multiplying, media asking for comment, Analysts demanding clarity. Another from Daniel. Systems stable. No anomalies overnight. A third from an unknown number that she did not open. The elevator doors closed, sealing her in with her reflection. The lines in her face were more pronounced in the harsh light. She did not look away. On the production floor, the day shift was already in motion. Machines hummed. Conveyors rattled to life. The smell of oil and warm metal wrapped around her as she stepped out, unannounced, into the heart of the operation. Conversations stopped. Not because she demanded silence, because people noticed. A woman in her 50s, safety vest still zipped, stared for a long second before whispering to the man beside her. A younger technician lowered his headset, eyes tracking Margaret as she walked past. There was no applause this time, no murmurs, just attention. Margaret moved slowly, deliberately, letting herself be seen. She stopped beside a control panel where a man with silver hair was reviewing diagnostics. His name badge read, Frank Delaney, 32 years with the company. "Morning, Frank," she said. He looked up, startled. "Ma'am," he replied, then hesitated. "I didn't know you were coming down here." "I did," Margaret said. He nodded, swallowing. "They're saying a lot of things upstairs." "I imagine they are." He glanced around, then lowered his voice. "Are we going to be all right?" Margaret met his eyes. "Yes," she said, "but it's going to take honesty. On my end, too." Frank nodded once. That was enough. As she moved on, she felt it. The shift. Not relief yet. Something closer to cautious trust, bruised but not broken. On the executive floor, the mood was different. Doors opened and closed quickly. Assistants whispered into phones. A junior analyst froze when Margaret passed, then rushed to hold the door open, flustered. Daniel was waiting near the server room again, coffee untouched in his hand. "We have a situation," he said quietly. Margaret stopped. "Define situation." "Not sabotage," he replied. "Not yet, but Richard's camp is mobilizing. They're contacting former board allies, framing this as a hostile takeover." Margaret's jaw tightened. "Of their own company." Daniel nodded. "They're good at narratives." "So am I," Margaret said. She walked past him into a small conference room and closed the door behind them. The room smelled like marker ink and stale pastries. She stood at the head of the table, hands resting flat on the surface. "They will say I overreacted," she said. "They will say I'm out of touch, that I came back emotional." Daniel frowned. "Anyone who knows you knows what I built," Margaret interrupted. "Not who I am now." She straightened. "We don't counter lies with spin. We counter them with visibility." Daniel considered that. "Town hall?" "No," Margaret said. "Not yet. First, we show our work." By mid-morning, Margaret was in a windowless meeting room with finance, operations, and compliance leads. No titles on the door, no hierarchy at the table, just names and responsibility. She listened more than she spoke. Numbers came out, real ones. Delayed maintenance, deferred upgrades. Departments stretched thin while executive travel budgets ballooned. Faces tightened as people spoke truths they had buried for months. "This didn't start with them," a woman from compliance said quietly. "It started when we learned silence was safer than escalation." Margaret nodded. "That ends today." A knock interrupted them. Eleanor stepped in, her expression controlled but tense. "They've retained outside counsel," she said. "Aggressive, high profile." Margaret didn't flinch. "Good," she said. "Then they'll understand process." Eleanor hesitated. "They're also questioning your capacity, age, health, decision-making under stress." Margaret leaned back, exhaling slowly through her nose. There it was. The line she had known would come. "Let them," she said. Eleanor studied her. "You're sure?" Margaret's voice was calm. "I've been underestimated my entire life. I don't correct it anymore. I use it." The meeting resumed. Plans formed. Temporary reporting lines. Clear documentation trails. Oversight committees with teeth, not titles. By noon, the building buzzed differently. Not with fear, with movement. Margaret stood alone for a moment in her old office, the one she had rarely used even before she stepped away. Dust had gathered along the window frame. She brushed it aside with her sleeve, watching the particles scatter in the light. She sat at the desk and opened a drawer. Inside lay a notebook, old, leather-bound. Her handwriting filled the pages, tight and urgent. Early goals, early fears. A line she had written years ago caught her eye. Power unused is power misunderstood. She closed the notebook. Her phone rang. Unknown number again. This time she answered. "Marga Stewart," she said. A pause. Then Richard's voice. Quieter now, controlled. "We need to talk." Margaret's gaze drifted to the window, to the city beyond. "We already have," she replied. "But if you have something new to say, you know where to find me." The line went dead. Margaret set the phone down carefully. Outside, clouds rolled in over Cleveland, thick and low, pressing against the skyline. The air shifted, heavy, expectant. Margaret rose from the desk, straightened her jacket, and stepped back into the corridor. This was no longer about reclaiming authority. This was about redefining what it meant. And the hardest part was still ahead. Morning arrived without drama. No sirens, no engines, just pale light sliding across the snowfields and settling gently against the farmhouse windows. Margaret woke in her chair by the window, stiff but rested in a way she hadn't felt in years. The clock read 6:42 in the morning. She noted it without hurry. She rose slowly, joints complaining, and stood there until the dizziness passed. It did. It always did. The house was quiet but not hollow. The repairs held. The air was still. She made coffee, stronger this time. The smell filled the kitchen, grounding, familiar. As the kettle heated, she noticed something she hadn't the night before. The silence no longer pressed in on her ears. It existed. It did not accuse. Outside, tire tracks crisscrossed the yard, but already the edges were softening under fresh snow, evidence fading, as it always did. She carried her mug to the table and opened the folder Daniel had left behind. She read it again, slower this time. Legal aid contacts, county numbers, a handwritten note at the bottom. "Call me if anyone gives you trouble." They won't, but still. Margaret folded the paper neatly and slid it back into the folder. She did not rush to the phone. She had learned that urgency was often borrowed panic. A knock came at the door, not loud, not demanding, 3 steady taps. Margaret did not startle. She crossed the room and opened the door without hesitation. A woman stood on the porch, late 60s, heavy coat, hair pulled back too tight. Her eyes were sharp with curiosity and something close to discomfort. "Morning," the woman said. "I'm Elaine Foster. I live down the road." Margaret nodded. "I know." Elaine shifted her weight. "People are talking." "They usually do." Elaine glanced past her into the house. The warmth, the solidity. "They said you had company." Margaret met her gaze. "I did." Elaine hesitated. "They said it was a lot of them." "It was." Another pause. Elaine's voice lowered. "You scared some folks." Margaret considered her carefully. "Fear is rarely about the thing in front of you," she said. "It's about what you don't want to admit you've been ignoring." Elaine frowned. "That's not fair." "No," Margaret agreed. "It's accurate." Elaine's shoulders dropped slightly. "I brought soup," she said, holding up a container. "I didn't know what else to do." Margaret stepped aside. "Then you did fine." Elaine entered, awkward, eyes scanning the room. "Everything looks different." Margaret took the soup. Some things were fixed. Elaine nodded slowly. "I heard the county might help you now." Margaret set the container on the counter. "They might." "And you didn't ask them?" Margaret looked at her. "Not until they were ready to listen." Elaine exhaled. "I didn't know you were struggling." Margaret's voice was calm. "You didn't ask." That landed. Elaine looked down. "I should have." "Yes," Margaret said, "you should have." Silence stretched. Then Elaine straightened. If you need help clearing snow this winter, I'll let you know. Elaine nodded, accepting the boundary, then turned to leave. At the door, she paused. For what it's worth, she said, I'm glad you didn't freeze. Margaret met her eyes. So am I. After the door closed, Margaret stood alone again, but the solitude had changed shape. She sat back down with her coffee and stared out at the road. A county truck passed in the distance, slower than usual, observing, measuring. Her phone rang. She let it ring twice before answering. Margaret Collins. Mrs. Collins, a man said. Polite, official. This is the county assessor's office. We've been made aware of some concerns regarding your property. Margaret smiled faintly. I imagine you have. There was a pause. Papers rustled. We'd like to schedule a review. No penalties, just a conversation. That's new, she said. Yes, the man admitted. It is. She looked out at the fields again. I'm available Thursday morning. Another pause. We'll be there. She hung up and leaned back in her chair. Nothing had been solved yet, not really, but something had shifted. Power rarely announced itself. It adjusted quietly, then waited to see who noticed. Margaret noticed. She finished her coffee, stood, and pulled on her coat. Outside, the cold met her like an old acquaintance. She welcomed it. The world was moving again, and this time, it was moving around her. The next morning, the storm broke the city open. Rainwater ran along the curbs in fast silver lines as Margaret crossed the street toward the courthouse annex 2 blocks from headquarters. She did not carry an umbrella. She welcomed the cold. It sharpened her focus. Every step echoed against stone older than any contract she had ever signed. Inside, the air smelled like paper and metal detectors. Eleanor was already there, coat draped over one arm, jaw set. They filed at dawn, she said without preamble. Emergency injunction. Claims of unlawful seizure of executive authority. Margaret nodded. Of course they did. Daniel arrived moments later, hair still damp, eyes rimmed red. They're pushing the age angle hard, he said, implying diminished capacity, citing your medical leave from 3 years ago. Margaret stopped walking, turned to face him. Then today, she said calmly, we remind them what capacity actually looks like. The hearing room was smaller than expected, wood-paneled, intentionally modest, designed to strip spectacle from power. Richard sat at one table with his counsel, posture rigid, jaw clenched. Thomas sat beside him, avoiding eye contact, fingers tapping a nervous rhythm against a legal pad. Margaret took her seat across from them. She did not look away when Richard finally met her eyes. There was something else there now, not defiance, calculation tinged with regret. The judge entered, gray-haired, unimpressed. Let's proceed. Richard's attorney spoke first, smooth, confident, framed the narrative cleanly. A founder returned after years away, emotional, overreached, destabilized leadership without due process, risked thousands of jobs. Margaret listened without reaction. When Eleanor stood, the room shifted. Not because of volume, because of precision. She spoke of fiduciary duty, of concealed communications, of documents time-stamped, archived, verified. She did not embellish. She did not attack. Then she sat. The judge turned to Margaret. Ms. Lewis, he said, you may speak if you wish. Margaret rose. She did not bring notes. I didn't come back because I missed authority, she began. I came back because I recognized neglect. She looked at Richard then, not with anger, with clarity. I trusted people to care for something larger than themselves. They chose convenience instead. Richard shifted. His attorney leaned in, whispering urgently. Margaret continued. I am not here to punish ambition. I am here to stop erasure. The judge studied her for a long moment. You're asking this court to deny an injunction that would restore the executive team. Yes, Margaret said. Because restoration without accountability is repetition. Silence followed, heavy, deliberate. I'll take this under advisement, the judge said finally, ruling by end of day. Outside the courthouse, the city felt louder, Sirens, traffic, reporters waiting behind barricades, cameras already trained. Eleanor exhaled. That could have gone worse. Margaret nodded. It could have gone quieter, she said. That would have worried me more. Back at the building, the atmosphere had changed again. Tighter, more alert. Employees moved with purpose now, not fear. When Margaret stepped off the elevator, conversations paused, then resumed. She was no longer a rumor. She was a presence. Daniel met her at the door. Helix is escalating, he said. They leaked a partial memo, out of context. Margaret's lips pressed thin. Of course they did. They're framing this as a race issue now, he continued carefully, trying to bait a reaction. Margaret stopped, turned slowly. They're not wrong about one thing, she said. This is about who gets believed. Daniel waited. They assume my credibility is conditional, she went on, that it expires with age, with absence, with color. She straightened. We don't respond emotionally. We respond structurally. By early afternoon, the judge's ruling arrived. Denied. No injunction. Executive authority remained suspended. The message spread through the building not as celebration, but as relief. A quiet loosening. People returned to work with steadier hands. Margaret stood alone in her office when Eleanor brought the news. For a moment, she said nothing. Then she closed her eyes. It's not over, Eleanor warned. Margaret opened them. No, she agreed. But now it's honest. Late in the day, Richard requested a meeting. No lawyers, just conversation. Margaret considered, then agreed. They met in a small conference room, neutral ground. Richard looked older now, less certain. The confidence had drained, leaving something raw behind. I never thought you'd come back like this, he said. Margaret folded her hands. I never thought you'd forget why I left. He winced. We were under pressure. So was I, Margaret said. Every day I built this. He swallowed. Helix offered security. They always do, she replied, until they take it away. Richard looked down. What happens to me? Margaret's voice softened just slightly. That depends on what you choose next. He nodded slowly. I should have called you. Yes, she said. You should have. When he left, Margaret remained seated, staring at the empty chair across from her. The cost of leadership sat there too, quiet, unavoidable. As evening settled, Daniel returned with one last update. We've locked down the final exposure points, he said. Nothing else hidden. Margaret stood, walked to the window. The city glowed again, rain-washed and restless. Tomorrow, there would be more hearings, more headlines, more attempts to redefine what had happened. But tonight, the company stood intact. Margaret turned back to Daniel. Thank you, she said. He nodded. For what? For remembering, she replied. When he left, Margaret shut off the lights and gathered her coat. She paused at the door, taking one last look at the room. The desk, the chair, the space she had once stepped away from, believing it would remain whole without her. She understood now that stewardship was not a phase. It was a posture, one you either held or surrendered. Margaret stepped into the hallway, footsteps steady, unhurried. The building hummed around her, and for the first time in a long while, it felt like it was breathing in sync with her again. The ruling did not end the war. It changed the temperature. Margaret Lewis felt it the moment she stepped back into the building the following morning. Not resistance, not relief, something quieter and more dangerous. Calculation. People were watching not to see what she would say, but what she would allow. The elevators moved slower. Conversations stopped a half-second too late. The company was no longer fractured. It was alert. She welcomed that. By 8:30, the final audit package was complete. Not summarized, not softened. Every document intact. Every email thread preserved. Every financial trail mapped in plain language that could survive daylight. Eleanor Brooks reviewed it once more, glasses perched low, fingers steady despite the weight of what they held. Once this goes out, she said, there's no controlling how it's used. Margaret nodded. That's the point. The board reconvened at 9. This time, no hesitation, no testing the edges. The denial of the injunction had clarified loyalties. Votes aligned. Oversight committees were reconstituted. Interim controls ratified. The machinery of governance began to move the way it was meant to. Slowly, publicly, irreversibly. Richard Coleman was not present. Margaret did not comment on that. She had learned long ago that absence spoke louder than defense. By midday, the press conference was unavoidable. Cameras lined the atrium. Reporters shifted, murmured, adjusted lenses. Margaret stood at the podium, not elevated, not shielded. Just present. Eleanor at her side. Daniel a few steps back, visible but not centered. The symbolism mattered. Margaret did not read a statement. She spoke plainly. She spoke about duty, about transparency, about the difference between growth and extraction. She did not mention race. She did not mention age. She did not mention betrayal. She spoke about responsibility as if it were a shared language, not a weapon. When a reporter pressed about turmoil, Margaret answered without flinch. Stability built on silence is not stability, she said. It is delay. When another asked about leadership style, she replied, I don't lead to be admired. I lead to be accountable. The questions came faster. She met them all, calm, direct, unyielding. When it ended, applause did not break out. That was fine. Applause fades. Understanding lasts longer. That afternoon, the first resignations arrived. Quiet ones. Executives who understood the landscape had shifted beyond their comfort. Margaret accepted them without comment, without spectacle. She replaced them with interim leaders chosen not for ambition, but for memory. People who knew the company before it learned to hide from itself. At 4:15, Daniel stepped into her office. We've closed the final loop, he said. No more exposure. Helix withdrew. Margaret looked up from the document she was signing. They didn't withdraw, she said. They lost interest. Daniel allowed himself a small breath. Same thing. Margaret stood and walked to the window. Cleveland stretched beneath her, stubborn and unpolished and alive. This was not a city that forgot easily. It remembered who showed up when things went wrong. Her phone buzzed once. A message from an unfamiliar number. No threats this time, just a line. You won. Margaret stared at it for a moment, then deleted it. Winning had never been the goal. As evening approached, the building softened. People left their desks without glancing over their shoulders. Machines shut down in their proper sequence. Lights dimmed in sections that had worked too long without rest. Margaret walked the floors one last time, not as surveillance, but as presence. A nod, a brief word, a hand on a shoulder. She listened. She remembered names. In the boardroom, the chairs had been reset, the table cleared. The room looked the way it had years ago, ready, not guarded. Margaret took her seat at the head, not because she needed to, but because the space demanded ownership again. She opened the leather notebook from her drawer and wrote one line. Never confuse quiet with consent. She closed it. Outside, the city darkened into something reflective. Streetlights flickered on. Traffic hummed. Somewhere below, a factory horn signaled the end of a shift. Margaret felt the ache settle in then. Not regret. Responsibility that had weight, that always had. Eleanor appeared at the door. It's done, she said. Margaret nodded. It's begun. When Eleanor left, Margaret remained seated, hands folded, breathing steady. She thought of the woman she had been when she built this place. Tired, certain, afraid only of failing people she could see. She thought of the woman she was now, older, sharper, afraid only of failing those who trusted her silence. She rose, turned off the lights, and walked out without looking back. The building held, the company endured, and Margaret Lewis did not disappear again. If this story resonated with you, like the video, subscribe for more, and share your thoughts in the comments with these 3 words: truth over power.